Before we dive into one of the most brilliant military campaigns in American history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This is the story of Daniel Morgan, a frontier fighter who turned the tide of the Revolutionary War in the South with one of the most perfectly executed battles ever fought on American soil. Congress, on the 16th of June, 1780, directed Daniel Morgan of the Virginia line, with his old rank of colonel, to be employed in the Southern Army as Major General Gates should direct. Morgan had been justly aggrieved at the slight recognition by Gates of his services in the capture of Burgoyne. But when he heard of the defeat at Camden and the dispersal of the American army, he hastened to the scene of disaster and before the end of September arrived at Hillsborough. There, Gates was doing all that he could to draw together the remains of the regular army. The militia of North Carolina joined him in considerable force. Marion was in the neighborhood of the Santee and Sumter on the west of that river. Davie of North Carolina, with dragoons and mounted riflemen, had repaired to the Waxhaw settlement. Colonel Clark, at the head of exiles from Georgia and South Carolina, was near Augusta. The mountaineers of the West, under Campbell, Cleveland, Williams, Sevier, McDowell, and others, were gathering for a descent upon the British posts in South Carolina and Georgia. Cornwallis was planning junction of his forces at Charlotte with the intention of proceeding into Virginia. The governor of North Carolina, holding Colonel Morgan's character as a soldier to be well known in America and his presence sure to give spirit to his countrymen, requested him to take command of a regiment of the militia of North Carolina. This Morgan declined, for Gates received him with cordiality and destined him for special service. Men enough to fill 4 companies were chosen out of 2 battalions and formed into a light infantry battalion, which, with the company of riflemen of Captain Rose, had Lieutenant Colonel Howard for its chief. The remains of 2 regiments of cavalry were united under Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, and the whole were constituted a separate corps in the command of Morgan. Nor was Morgan without powerful friends. Jefferson, the governor of Virginia, who was keen-sighted in discerning all the resources of that extensive commonwealth, and Rutledge, the great chief magistrate of South Carolina, with the approval of Gates, wrote letters to Congress that the public service in the Southern Department would be greatly advanced by his promotion to the rank of brigadier general. By their joint influence, on the 13th of October, 6 days after the Battle of Kings Mountain, he was promoted to that rank in the Army of the United States. Colonel Otho Williams, then the Adjutant General of the Southern Army, congratulated him on the justice Congress had done him. On the day following the promotion of Morgan, Washington, acting under a power delegated to him by Congress, announced his selection of Major General Greene to relieve Gates of the chief command in the Southern Department. On the 30th of October, Congress, confirming the nomination of Greene, assigned to him all the regular troops raised or to be raised in Delaware and the states south of it, and conferred on him all the powers that had been vested in Gates, but subject to the control of the commander-in-chief. Thus, the conduct of the war obtained, for the first time, the unity essential to success. Washington was in danger of being shortly without men. Yet he detached for the service in the Carolinas Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee, his best cavalry officer, with the corps called the Legion, consisting of 3 troops of horse and 3 companies of infantry, in all 350 men. Hamilton, weary of the silent tasks of a secretary and impatient to gain a name in the world by the command of troops in the light of day, having for his object to act a conspicuous part in some enterprise that might raise his character as a soldier above mediocrity, spoke to Washington about going to the southward with Greene. But he could not at the time be spared by the commander-in-chief, and reluctantly yielded. For Greene, Washington prepared a welcome in the South, writing to George Mason, "I introduce this gentleman as a man of abilities, bravery, and coolness. He has a comprehensive knowledge of our affairs and is a man of fortitude and resources. I have the smallest doubt, therefore, of his employing all the means which may be put into his hands to the best advantage, nor of his assisting in pointing out the most likely ones to answer the purposes of his command.
General Washington's influence, so Greene wrote to Hamilton, will do more than all the assemblies upon the continent. I always thought him exceedingly popular, but in many places he is little less than adored and universally admired. From being the friend of the general, I found myself exceedingly well received. At Charlotte, where Greene arrived on the 2nd of December, he received a complaint from Cornwallis respecting the execution of prisoners after the fight at King's Mountain, coupled with a threat of retaliation. Avowing his own respect for the principles of humanity and the law of nations, Greene answered by sending him a list of about 50 men who had been hanged by Lord Cornwallis himself and others high in the British service, and he called on mankind to sit in judgment on the order of Lord Cornwallis to Balfour after the action near Camden, on Lord Rawdon's proclamation, and on the ravages of Tarleton. No American officer in his department in any one instance imitated the cruelties systematically practiced by the British. Sumter spared all prisoners, though the worst men were among them. Marion was famed for his mercy. Cruelty was never imputed to Williams, Pickens, or any other of the American chiefs. But the British officers continued to ridicule the idea of observing capitulations with Americans, insisting that those who claimed to be members of an independent state could derive no benefit from any solemn engagement and were but vanquished traitors who owed their lives to British clemency. In the course of the winter, Colonel William Cunningham, under orders from Colonel Balfour at Charleston, led 150 white men and Negroes into the interior settlements. On his route, he killed about 50 of those whom he suspected of being friends to the United States and burned their habitations. At length, he came to a house which sheltered an American party of 35 men under Colonel Hayes. These, refusing to surrender at discretion, a fire from both sides was kept up for about 3 hours, when the British succeeded in setting the house in flames. In this extremity, the besieged capitulated under the agreement that they should be treated as prisoners of war until they could be exchanged. The capitulation was formally signed and interchanged, and yet the Americans had no sooner marched out than the British hanged Colonel Hayes to the limb of a tree. The second in command was treated in like manner, after which Cunningham, with his own hands, slew some of the prisoners and desired his men to follow his example. One of them traversed the ground where his old neighbors and acquaintances lay dead and dying, and ran his sword through those in whom he saw signs of life. These facts were afterward established by a judicial investigation. Gates, before his departure, had brought together 2,307 men, of whom a little more than one-half were militia. 800 were properly clothed and equipped. Greene was by nature firm and adventurous and rapid in decision. Now, when after 4 years' service he assumed the chief command in the Southern Department, he avoided every risk and carried caution almost to irresolution. The country round Charlotte had been ravaged. Sending Kosciuszko in advance to select a site for an encampment, Greene marched his army to the head of boat navigation on the PD. There, in a fertile and unexhausted country, at the falls of the river, he established what he named a camp of repose to improve the discipline and spirits of his men and to gain for himself an opportunity of looking about, leaving Morgan and the corps which Gates had confided to his separate command as the sole object of attraction to the army of Cornwallis. Morgan, with his small detached force, crossed the Catawba just below the mouth of the Little Catawba and, passing Broad River, on the 25th of December, encamped on the north bank of the Pacolet. Here he was joined by mounted Carolinians under Colonel Pickens and Georgians under Major McCall.
General Davidson of North Carolina on the 29th brought 120 men into his camp, but left immediately to collect more.
Morgan was at that time the ablest commander of light troops in the world. In no European army of that day were there troops like those which he trained. Instructed in vigilance by life in the backwoods, he had organized a system for obtaining speedy and exact information as to the designs and movements of his disproportionately powerful enemy. Greene offered him wagons. Wagons, he answered on the last day of the year 1780, would be an impediment whether we attempt to annoy the enemy or provide for our own safety. It is incompatible with the nature of light troops to be encumbered with luggage. Hearing that a large party of Georgia Tories was plundering the neighborhood of Fair Forest, Morgan sent Lieutenant Colonel William Washington with his own regiment and mounted riflemen under McCall to attack them. Coming up with them at about 12 o'clock on the 30th, William Washington extended his mounted riflemen on their wings and charged them in front with his own cavalry. The Tories fled after great loss in battle, leaving 40 as prisoners. Cornwallis, who, when joined by the reinforcement of 2,000 men sent to him from New York by way of Charleston under Leslie, could advance with 3,500 fighting men, was impatient of the successes of Morgan and resolved to intercept his retreat. On the 2nd of January, 1781, he ordered Tarleton, the officer on whom he most relied, to cross Broad River, writing, "Dear Tarleton, if Morgan is still anywhere within your reach, I shall wish you to push him to the utmost. No time is to be lost." Tarleton answered by promising either to destroy Morgan's corps or push it before him over Broad River toward King's Mountain. And he wished the main army to advance so as to be ready to capture the fugitives. "I feel bold in offering my opinion," he wrote, "as it flows from well-founded inquiry concerning the enemy's designs." To this, Cornwallis replied, "You have understood my intentions perfectly." Morgan had reported to Greene, "Forage and provisions are not to be had. Here we cannot subsist." In consequence of the exhausted condition of the country in which he was stationed, his whole force could never be kept together. Parties, from necessity, were always straggling in search of food. He had requested Greene to recall his detachment to the main army or to suffer him to pass into Georgia. Neither of these requests being approved of, he next asked that a diversion might be made in his favor. This request, too, Greene saw reasons for declining. The danger to Morgan was imminent, for the light troops of the British were pursuing him on the one side and their main army preparing to intercept his retreat on the other. On the 14th, Tarleton passed the Inori and Tiger rivers above the Cherokee Ford. On the afternoon of the 15th, Morgan encamped at Burr's Mills on Thickety Creek and wrote to Greene his wish to avoid an action. "But this," he added, "will not be always in my power." His scouts informed him that Tarleton had crossed the Tiger at Musgrove's Mills with a force of 11 or 1,200 men. On the 16th, he put himself and his party in full motion toward Broad River, while in the evening his camp of the morning was occupied by Tarleton's party. The same day, Cornwallis with his army reached Turkey Creek. In South Carolina, where the grass is springing through every month of winter, cattle in those days grazed all the year round, never housed nor fed by the hand of man, but driven from time to time into cowpens, where the owners gave salt to the herd, and each one marked those which were his own. 2 miles from such an enclosure, on a wide plain covered with primeval pines and chestnut and oak, about 16 miles from Spartanburg, 7 miles from the Cherokee Ford on the Broad River, and a little less than 5 miles from the line of North Carolina, Morgan encamped his party for the night. His former position subjected him at once to the operations of Cornwallis and Tarleton, and in case of a defeat, his retreat might have easily been cut off. At the Cowpens, he was in a position to improve any advantage he might gain and to provide better for his own security should he be unfortunate.
With a noble confidence in himself, in his officers, and in his men, Morgan resolved to give battle to his pursuers. In the evening, he moved among his fellow soldiers, sustaining their cheerfulness. During the night, Pickens returned from a short absence with more than 100 militia, and another party of 50 came in. The moment was come when it was safest to fight. On the 17th, at an hour before daylight, Morgan, through his excellent system of spies, knew that Tarleton's troops were approaching his camp. His own men, numbering 80 cavalry and 237 infantry of the troops of the United States, and 553 militia from the states of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, quietly breakfasted and prepared for battle. The ground chosen was an open wood between the springs of two little rivulets, with a slight ridge extending from one of them to the other. The wood was free from undergrowth. No thicket offered covert, no swamp a refuge from cavalry. The best troops were placed in line on the rising ground. The Maryland Light Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Howard, formed the center. 2 companies of approved Virginia riflemen were on each wing. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington and his cavalry were placed as a reserve, out of sight and out of fire. The volunteers from the Carolinas and Georgia were posted under Pickens in advance so as to defend the approaches. About 60 sharpshooters of the North Carolina volunteers were to act as skirmishers on the right flank, 150 yards in front of the line, and as many more of the Georgians at the same distance on the left. Tarleton's troops, numbering a little more than 1,100, having 2 field pieces and a great advantage in bayonets and cavalry, after a march of 12 miles, came in sight at 8 o'clock and drew up in a single line of battle. The Legion infantry formed their center, with the 7th Regiment on the right, the 71st on the left, and 2 light companies of 100 men each on the flanks. The artillery moved in front. Tarleton, with 280 cavalry, was in the rear. No sooner were they formed than their whole line rushed forward with the greatest impetuosity and with shouts. They were received by a heavy and well-directed fire, first from the American skirmishers and then from the whole of Pickens' command. But their superiority of numbers enabled them to gain the flanks of the Americans, who were thus obliged to change their position. They drew back in good order about 50 paces, formed, advanced on the enemy, and gave them a volley which threw them into disorder. The Virginia riflemen, who had kept their places, instinctively formed themselves on the sides of the British, so that they, who 2 or 3 minutes before had threatened to turn the Americans, found themselves, as it were, within a pair of open pincers, exposed to the converging oblique fire of 2 companies of sharpshooters on each flank, and a direct fire in front. Lieutenant Colonel Howard perceived the wavering of the British and gave orders for the line to charge with bayonets, which was done with such address that the enemy fled with the utmost precipitation, leaving their field pieces behind them. The Americans followed up their advantages so effectually that the British had no opportunity of rallying. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, having been informed that Tarleton was cutting down the riflemen on the left, pushed forward and charged his party with such firmness that they broke their ranks and fled, while Tarleton made no attempt to recover the day. They were completely routed and were pursued 24 miles by the cavalry. Of the Americans, only 12 were killed and 60 wounded. Of the enemy, 10 commissioned officers were killed and more than 100 rank and file. 200 were wounded. 29 commissioned officers and more than 500 privates were taken prisoners, besides 70 Negroes. 2 standards, upward of 100 dragoon horses, 35 wagons, 800 muskets, and 2 field pieces that had been taken from the British at Saratoga and retaken at Camden fell into the hands of the victors.
The immense baggage of Tarleton's party, which had been left in the rear, was destroyed by the British themselves. Our success, wrote the victor in his modest report, must be attributed to the justice of our cause and the gallantry of our troops. My wishes would induce me to name every sentinel in the corps. The victory came because the officers were excellent. The men, of whom every one was at heart a volunteer, were bent on doing their whole duty and sure that their general knew how to command them. Every officer and soldier felt himself one with his general in will, counsel, and action. Congress, attempting to sum up the merit of Morgan in 3 words, instinctively wrote, "Virtus unita valet," united virtue prevails. The army was fashioned by its general into one life, one devotedness, one energy. It is impossible, so on the day after the battle wrote Cornwallis, the nearest and most deeply interested observer, to the British commander-in-chief in America, it is impossible to foresee all the consequences that this unexpected and extraordinary event may produce. As the defeat of Ferguson at Kings Mountain made to Lord Cornwallis the first invasion of North Carolina impossible, so Tarleton foresaw that the Battle of Cowpens would make the second disastrous. The battle was ended 2 hours before noon. The prudence of Morgan was equal to his daring. Aware that the camp of Cornwallis at Turkey Creek was within about 20 miles of him and nearer the fords of the Catawba through which he must retire, Morgan destroyed the captured baggage wagons, paroled the British officers, entrusted the wounded to the care of the few residents of the neighborhood, and, leaving his cavalry to follow him on their return from the pursuit, on the day of the battle he crossed the broad river with his foot soldiers and his prisoners, the captured artillery, muskets, and ammunition. Proceeding by easy marches of 10 miles a day, on the 23rd he crossed the Catawba at Sherald's Ford. Taking for his troops a week's rest in his camp north of the river, he sent forward his prisoners to Salisbury under the guard of Virginia militia whose time of service had just expired. They were soon beyond the Yadkin on their way to Virginia. The fame of the great victory at the Cowpens spread in every direction. Greene announced it in general orders, and his army saluted the victors as the finest fellows on earth, more worthy than ever of love. Rutledge of South Carolina repeated their praises and rewarded Pickens with a commission as brigadier. Davidson of North Carolina wrote that the victory gladdened every countenance and paved the way for the salvation of the country. The state of Virginia voted to Morgan a horse and a sword in testimony of the highest esteem of his country for his military character and abilities so gloriously displayed. The United States in Congress placed among their records the most lively sense of approbation of the conduct of Morgan and the men and officers under his command. To him they voted a gold medal, to Howard and William Washington medals of silver, and swords to Pickens and Triplet. Cornwallis had entreated Tarleton to make haste and attack the light troops of Morgan, but had neglected measures to support him. In the condition of affairs, he had no good part to take but to remain in South Carolina and recover the mastery there if he could. But all his proud hopes rested on a successful campaign in Virginia. The day after the battle, he wrote to Sir Henry Clinton, "Nothing but the most absolute necessity shall induce me to give up the important object of the winter's campaign. Defensive measures would be certain ruin to the affairs of Britain in the southern colonies."
On his own responsibility and against the opinion of his superior officer, he persisted in his plan of striking at the heart of North Carolina, establishing there a royal government and pressing forward to a junction with the British troops on the Chesapeake. Leaving Lord Rawdon with a considerable body of troops to defend South Carolina, Cornwallis, with the reinforcement which Leslie had brought him, began his long march, which he meant should have been a hot pursuit of Morgan by avoiding the lower roads, there being so few fords in the great rivers below their forks. On the 25th, he collected his army at Ramsor's Mill on the south fork of the Catawba. Impatient of being encumbered and delayed there, he resolved to give up his communications with South Carolina and to turn his army into light troops. The measure, if not in every respect absurd, was adopted too late. 2 days he devoted to destroying baggage and all wagons except those laden with hospital stores, salt, and ammunition, and 4 reserved for the sick and wounded, thus depriving his soldiers even of a regular supply of provisions.
Then, by forced marches through floods of rain, he approached the river, which, having risen too high to be forded, stopped his march till its waters should subside. Morgan, from the first, had divined the policy of Cornwallis, and on the 25th of January had written to Greene advising a junction of their forces. On the morning of the 30th of January, Greene arrived at Morgan's encampment, attended only by a few dragoons. He readily adopted his advice, and on that very day gave orders to the army on the PD to prepare to form a junction at Guildford Courthouse with those under Morgan, with whom he remained. On the first day of February, Cornwallis, with a part of his army, passed the Catawba at McGowan's Ford. The dark stream was near 500 yards wide, with a rocky bottom and a strong current, and was perseveringly disputed by General Davidson of North Carolina with 300 militia, till in resisting the landing, a volley of musketry was aimed at him with deadly effect. In him fell one of the bravest and best of those who gave their lives for the independence of their country. 40 of the British light infantry and grenadiers were killed or wounded. The horse which Cornwallis rode was struck while in the stream, but reached the shore before falling. The other division passed the Catawba at Beatty's Ford, and the United Army encamped about 5 miles from the river on the road to Salisbury. On the 2nd and 3rd of February, the American light infantry, continuing their march with the British at their heels, crossed the Yadkin at the trading ford, partly on flats, during the latter part of the time in a heavy rain. The river, after the Americans were safe beyond it and Morgan had secured all watercraft on its south side, rose too high to be forded. The Americans looked upon Providence as their ally. Cornwallis was forced to lose 2 days in ascending the Yadkin to the so-called Shallow Ford, where he crossed on the 7th, and on the night of the 9th encamped near the Moravian settlement of Salem. There, near the edge of the wilderness, on a genial clime and on a bountiful soil, hospitable emigrants bound by their faith never to take up arms had chosen their abodes, and for their sole defense had raised the symbol of the triumphant Lamb. Among them equality reigned. No one then or thereafter was held in bondage. There were no poor, and none marked from others by their apparel or their dwellings. Everywhere appeared simplicity and neatness. The elders watched over the members of the congregation, and incurable wrongdoers were punished by expulsion. After their hours of toil came the hour for prayer, exhortations, and the singing of psalms and hymns. Under their well-directed labor, the wilderness blossomed like the rose.
On the same day, at the distance of 5 and 20 miles from Cornwallis, the 2 divisions of the American Army effected their junction at Guildford Courthouse. Then General Morgan, emaciated and crippled by combined attacks of fever and rheumatism, took a leave of absence. Never again during the war was he able to resume a command. Wherever he appeared, he heralded the way to daring action and almost always to success. In 1774, when he was at the mouth of the river Hockhocking on the return from a victorious Indian campaign, he and other triumphant Virginians, hearing that New England was preparing to resist in arms encroachments on their liberty, pledged their support to the people of Boston. In the early summer of 1775, he raised a company of 96 riflemen, and in 21 days, without the loss of one of them, marched them from West Virginia to Boston. He commanded the van in the struggle through the wilderness to Canada. Thrice he led a forlorn hope before Quebec. To him belongs the chief glory of the first great engagement with Burgoyne's army, and he shared in all that followed till the surrender. And now he had won at the Cowpens the most astonishing victory of the war. He took with him into retirement the praises of all the army and of the chief civil representatives of the country. Daniel Morgan was 50 years old when he left active service. Born on the frontier, raised in the wilderness, he had known hardship from his earliest days. As a young man driving wagons for the British Army during the French and Indian War, he had received 500 lashes for striking a British officer. The punishment should have killed him. Instead, it made him stronger, meaner, tougher. He carried the scars on his back for the rest of his life, and he never forgot what British discipline felt like. He was not educated. He could barely write, but he understood men, and he understood war in a way that no officer trained at a military academy could match. He knew how to read terrain. He knew how to move fast. He knew how to choose ground for a fight. And most importantly, he knew how to inspire absolute confidence in the men who followed him. When Morgan said they would win, they believed him. When he placed them in position and told them what to do, they did it without question because they trusted him completely. The Battle of Cowpens was not won by accident. It was won by design. Morgan chose the ground deliberately. He placed his troops with precision. He told each unit exactly what to do, and he made sure every man understood the plan. The militia in front were told to fire 2 volleys and then fall back. They did exactly that. The Continental regulars behind them were told to hold their ground and then, at the right moment, charge with bayonets. They did exactly that. William Washington's cavalry was held in reserve, out of sight, waiting for the moment when the British line broke. When that moment came, Washington charged and turned a British defeat into a total rout. It was a perfect battle, one of the few times in military history when everything went exactly according to plan. And it was planned by a man who could barely sign his own name, but who understood warfare at a level that few officers in any army have ever reached. Morgan's reward was a gold medal from Congress, praise from Washington, and a body so broken down by disease and exhaustion that he could no longer serve. He went home to Virginia, crippled with rheumatism and fever, and watched from the sidelines as the war he had done so much to win moved toward its conclusion. He would live another 20 years, serve briefly in Congress, help suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, and die in his bed in 1802, respected and honored, but never properly understood by the society he had helped to create. Because Morgan was not a gentleman, he was not refined, he did not write elegant letters or give inspiring speeches or look good in a formal uniform. He was a rough, profane, hard-drinking backwoods fighter who led other rough backwoods fighters against the most professional army in the world and beat them every single time. The Battle of Cowpens was his masterpiece, and then he was done.
Greene, left in command of the army after Morgan's departure, now faced the full weight of Cornwallis's pursuit. The British general was determined to catch the American army and destroy it. He had burned his own baggage to move faster. He had cut himself off from his supply base in South Carolina. He had turned his entire army into light troops capable of rapid marches, and he drove them forward through rain and mud and rising rivers in pursuit of Greene. It became a race. Greene had to get his army to safety before Cornwallis could catch him. The two armies marched parallel to each other, sometimes only miles apart, both heading north toward the Dan River in Virginia. Cornwallis had the shorter route. Greene had the head start. Everything depended on speed and on the rivers. If the rivers stayed low, Cornwallis could ford them and cut off Greene's retreat. If the rivers rose, Greene could cross on boats and leave Cornwallis stranded on the south bank. Greene sent orders ahead to collect every boat on the Dan River and have them ready at the crossing points. He sent his baggage and his slowest troops ahead on the upper route toward the upper fords. He kept his light troops, now commanded by Otho Williams since Morgan was gone, as a screening force between his main army and Cornwallis, and he marched. Day after day through cold February rain, the American army marched north. Cornwallis marched just as hard. His men were exhausted. They had no tents. Their uniforms were falling apart. They were on half rations because Cornwallis had destroyed the wagons that carried their food. But Cornwallis drove them forward anyway, convinced that if he could just catch Greene's army, he could destroy it and end the rebellion in the south. On February 14th, Greene's army reached the Dan River. The boats were waiting. All day and all night they ferried troops across. By the morning of the 15th, the entire American army was safe on the north bank in Virginia. A few hours later, Cornwallis's advance guard arrived at the river. They were too late. Greene had escaped. Cornwallis stood on the south bank of the Dan and looked across at Virginia. He had marched his army 200 miles in the middle of winter. He had destroyed his own baggage and cut himself off from his supplies. He had driven his men to exhaustion, and he had nothing to show for it. Greene was safe. The American army was intact, and Cornwallis was deep in North Carolina with no supplies, no support, and an army that was falling apart. He had no choice but to fall back. He marched his exhausted troops south to Hillsborough, where he raised the British flag and issued a proclamation calling on Loyalists to join him. A few came in, not many. The people of North Carolina had seen what happened to Loyalists who joined the British. They had seen the hangings after King's Mountain. They had seen the burnings and the reprisals. Most of them decided to stay home and wait to see who won. Greene did not give Cornwallis time to rest. As soon as his army was across the Dan and safe in Virginia, he began planning his return to North Carolina. He waited only long enough for reinforcements to arrive, Virginia and North Carolina militia responding to calls from their governors. Then, less than 2 weeks after crossing into Virginia, he recrossed the Dan and moved south again into North Carolina. Cornwallis was not ready for this. He had expected Greene to stay in Virginia to rest his army and wait for spring. Instead, Greene was back in North Carolina with a reinforced army, maneuvering, threatening, forcing Cornwallis to respond. The British general found himself in the worst possible position. He was deep in hostile territory with no supplies. The Loyalists he had counted on were not joining him. His army was exhausted and hungry, and Greene was dancing around him, always just out of reach, threatening his foraging parties, cutting off his supplies, making it impossible for him to rest or resupply.
For 3 weeks this continued. Greene would advance, threaten, force Cornwallis to concentrate his army. Then Greene would fall back before Cornwallis could bring him to battle. Cornwallis would try to pursue, and Greene would slip away. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, except the mouse was armed and dangerous, and the cat was getting weaker every day. Finally, on March 14th, Greene decided the time had come to fight. His army had been reinforced to about 4,000 men, roughly equal to Cornwallis's force. He had been retreating for a month. His troops were ready. The ground was right. At Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, Greene drew up his army and waited for Cornwallis to attack. He used Morgan's plan from Cowpens: 3 lines of troops. The militia in front, told to fire 2 volleys and fall back. The Continental regulars in the second line, more reliable, expected to hold longer. The best troops, the veterans, in the third line, where the real fighting would be decided. It had worked perfectly at Cowpens. Greene hoped it would work again. It almost did. The battle began in the early afternoon. The North Carolina militia in the first line fired their 2 volleys as ordered and then ran. Most of them kept running all the way home. The Virginia militia in the second line fought harder, standing their ground for a time before falling back. And in the third line, the Continental regulars, the Delaware and Maryland troops that formed the core of Greene's army, stood and fought like demons. For over an hour, the third line held. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, bayonets and musket butts, men stabbing and clubbing each other in the smoke and confusion. The British pushed forward. The Americans pushed back. Units broke and rallied and broke again. At one point, William Washington's cavalry charged into the British Guards and drove them back in disorder. For a moment, it looked like the Americans might win. But Cornwallis was desperate. His army had marched 200 miles to get to this battle. If he lost everything. So when he saw his own troops and the Americans locked together in hand-to-hand combat, too close to separate, he ordered his artillery to fire grape shot into the melee. It killed his own men as well as the Americans, but it broke the deadlock. The Americans, already exhausted, pulled back. Greene saw that his army had fought as hard as it could. He had hurt Cornwallis badly, but he had not destroyed him. And if he stayed on the field and kept fighting, he risked losing his army. So he made the hardest decision a general can make. He ordered a retreat. His army withdrew from the field in good order, leaving Cornwallis in possession of the battlefield. Technically, Cornwallis won the Battle of Guildford Courthouse. He held the field at the end of the day. But he had lost over a quarter of his army. 532 casualties out of less than 2,000 British troops engaged. He had no supplies, no reinforcements, no way to replace his losses. His army was so battered and exhausted that he could not even pursue Greene's retreating force. He spent one night on the battlefield, then limped away toward the coast, desperately seeking a port where the British Navy could resupply him and evacuate his wounded. Greene's army had taken casualties too, but Greene could replace his losses. Militia would come and go, but the core of Continental regulars remained intact. And more importantly, Greene kept his army in the field. 2 days after the battle, he was back in position, ready to continue the campaign. Charles James Fox, the great Whig leader in Parliament, said of Guildford Courthouse, "Another such victory would ruin the British army." He was right. Cornwallis had won the battle and lost the campaign. He staggered to Wilmington on the North Carolina coast, where British ships could reach him. He rested his shattered army for 3 weeks, and then, because he could think of nothing else to do, he marched north into Virginia, abandoning the Carolinas and Georgia to Greene, and leaving Lord Rawdon with an inadequate force to try to hold what Cornwallis had conquered.
Greene did not follow Cornwallis into Virginia. That was Washington's problem. Greene had a different objective. With Cornwallis gone and Rawdon weak, Greene turned south and began the systematic reconquest of South Carolina and Georgia. It would take months. It would involve a dozen small battles and sieges. But in the end, Greene would drive the British back to Charleston and Savannah, liberating everything in between. The Southern Campaign, from Morgan's assumption of command in September 1780 to the end of active operations in 1782, was a masterpiece of strategic thinking and tactical execution. Morgan's victory at Cowpens destroyed the British light troops and made Cornwallis's invasion of North Carolina possible, but costly. Greene's retreat to the Dan saved the American army. The Battle of Guildford Courthouse shattered Cornwallis's force and drove him out of the Carolinas. And Greene's subsequent campaign liberated the South, bit by bit, until the British held only 2 port cities, and the rebellion they had tried so hard to crush was stronger than ever. None of it would have been possible without Morgan. The victory at Cowpens was the hinge on which the whole campaign turned. It destroyed British morale and British striking power. It proved that American troops, properly led and properly positioned, could not only stand against British regulars, but destroy them. And it made Morgan, for one brief moment, the most famous soldier in America. Then he went home, crippled and exhausted, and let younger men finish the war he had done so much to win. He never complained. He never asked for more recognition. He had done his duty. That was enough. But history remembers. The Battle of Cowpens remains, more than 2 centuries later, a textbook example of perfect tactical execution.
and Daniel Morgan remains one of the greatest combat commanders America has ever produced. If you found this story as compelling as I did, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. This is the history they don't teach in schools. The real stories of the men who fought and bled and died to create this country. Men like Daniel Morgan, who could barely write his own name, but who understood war better than any general in the British Army. Men who won impossible victories against overwhelming odds, and then went home to their farms and never bragged about what they had done. That is the American Revolution. Not the myth they teach in schools, but the reality. The blood and the mud and the impossible courage of men who refused to quit.